Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming. This should be such an interesting discussion about the experiences in New Orleans and what we've learned from those experiences. Today, we're so lucky to have Douglas Harris and Keith Oliveira on the panel. Doug is the founder and director of Education Alliance for New Orleans at Tulane University, where he's also a professor of economics and the Schleider Foundation Chair in Public Education. His research has helped inform and influence national debates over a range of education policies, especially in charter-based school reform, teacher evaluation, accountability, and college access. His first book, which was Value-Added Measures in Education, was nominated for the National Grawemeyer Prize in Education and published by Harvard Education Press. He has more than 50 academic articles that have been cited more than 3,000 times, and he's advised the White House, the US Senate, and several governors on education policy. He contributed to the Obama administration's transition team on measurement of school performance, advised the White House on college performance measures, and testified in the US Senate about the TRIO college access programs. Most recently, his Brookings report on community colleges helped shape President Obama's recent college reform, President Biden, sorry, Biden's recent college reform plans. Doug is also widely cited in the national media. He's recently been named one of the most influential economists studying education. Today, Doug will discuss key findings from his most recent book, which is Charter School City: What the End of Traditional Public Schools in New Orleans Means for American Education. Then after Doug goes and gives his talk, we'd like to work to better understand the Rhode Island context and what we can learn from those experiences. And we're lucky to have Keith Oliveira with us today to help us with that. Keith is a public education advocate, administrator, and policy official with over 25 years of public education experience. He has served as president of Providence School Board, presiding over Rhode Island's largest public school district. He also served in the Rhode Island Department of Education as a special assistant and policy advisor to one of the former education commissioners, as well as founding director of RIDE's charter school program. He co-founded Rhode Island Nurses Institute Charter School in Providence and served as chief operating officer from 2011 to 2017. He also helped found and continues to serve on the board of trustees of the Metropolitan Regional Career and Technical Center, which many of us know as the Met School, which if you don't know about it, please look into it. And since 2017, Keith has been the executive director of the Rhode Island League for Charter Schools, an association of 18 charter public schools across Rhode Island, serving over 6,700 students. Keith is a perfect person to help us understand Rhode Island's charter school experience and to help us think about the changes in schools in New Orleans post-Katrina and what we can learn from those changes. Welcome, both of you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, yeah.
For the process today, we're going to start with Doug talking about his research, and then I'll ask him a couple of follow-up questions if those seem useful. Then Keith will talk about Rhode Island and how New Orleans can help us think about the steps we could take here, either steps we should take and those we should be wary of. Then we'll have a bit of discussion on the panel and then open it up for audience questions. If you have questions while this is going on, please put it in the question and answer part. And then once we're in that part of the session, I'll do my best to have us address them. So without further ado, let's turn it to Professor Doug Harris. Doug?
All right. Thanks very much, Susanna. Can you see my slides?
Yes, it's
right.
yeah, there we go.
Well, this is great. I really appreciate being here. I've sort of followed what's been happening in Providence for a long time, and I'm realizing that this is 5 years ago. I actually was down or really up. I'm here in New Orleans at Brown, talking about the very early findings from what we were learning in New Orleans, and so really appreciate being back here to talk about it, and also having Keith here and Susanna, who have more of an on-the-ground sense of what's going on. That was part of the reason I wrote the book, was to have these kinds of conversations where we can think about lessons of New Orleans for other places where the context is different and the approaches might be different. So appreciate this. So let me start off by just saying, what are the New Orleans school reforms? They're they're talked about a lot, but I think it's important to talk about these things in specific terms. So, back after Katrina in 2005, the state took over almost all the publicly funded schools in the city, and then eventually and gradually turned them over to nonprofit charter schools to manage them. And those charter schools were subject to strict accountability through performance-based contracts. And I'll show they were strict in how they approached the accountability. And then these new school leaders were given autonomy over teachers, personnel, budget, the kinds of schools, the themes and curriculum and so on that they wanted to create. And families could choose the schools that they preferred. Eventually, that became a centralized enrollment system where families ranked their preferred options, and then a computer algorithm actually assigned them to schools. A very unusual, still being used in other cities to a smaller degree, but New Orleans is one of the first cities to try that at scale. So all of these different elements happened, in very short order, and these were all things that were quite unusual. In fact, when you think about why I would write a whole book about one city, was one of the reasons that it was the first district to eliminate essentially every element of traditional public schooling, and I think that makes it something that we need to better understand. As I'll show you, the reforms were also effective on every typical measure that we typically look at, and that was really also unusual to see positive effects across a wide variety of measures. And we spent a lot of time not just trying to understand whether it worked and so on, but what mechanisms, what exactly was it about the reform, since there are all these different pieces, trying to disentangle it a bit and try to understand what was most important about it, and as well as what did not go well. So it was far from perfect. Another reason for doing a whole book was that other cities like Providence are going down similar roads, not exactly the same thing, but similar concepts and similar ideas. And lastly, I'd say it's worth talking about New Orleans because it's so different. It took me years when I first got down here to really understand what was going on and how it was different from other places, because it's just so different on every dimension. So that's why I did this, and hopefully it's why that this will be a useful conversation. So let me talk first about the effects of the reforms on student outcomes. So this picture sort of sums it up when we think about the academic side of this. So on the left side there, you see different outcomes. The top one is test scores in elementary and middle school. The second one is VAM, or value added measures. That refers to the growth of student achievement over time, how much individual students are learning in school. The ACT score, the high school graduation rate, college entry rate. And then on each one of those lines, it's representing the number of districts in the state. So we have 68 districts in Louisiana, and the black dot is Louisiana in 2005. So you can see before the reforms that Louisiana was doing pretty badly on all of those measures. And then the gray dot indicates where it was in 2015, 10 years later, after the reforms had really settled in. And the message here is that all of the outcomes improved quite a bit. The high school graduation rate didn't improve as much, but still to see improvement and substantial improvement on so many measures was very unusual. We also looked at some non-traditional measures, parent satisfaction and voter satisfaction with the reforms. These were not our surveys. This is another group at Tulane, the Cowan Institute, that did these surveys. So the top one there, asking whether charter schools improved education in New Orleans in 2009. So that was 4 years after the reform, and 69% agreed. The next one actually distinguishes all parents, including private school parents, from charter school parents, and they're all supportive of the reforms and of the idea that schools are getting better, but that parents were actually even more supportive. Charter parents were more supportive than parents overall, which is a good signal. So the other survey measures there tell the same story. So it wasn't just that they got these measurable things to improve. So it wasn't that just one thing improved. Everything seemed to improve. So the question is why? I want to try to understand what it was about the reforms. So I just want to say a little bit first about what it was not, at least from the evidence, it doesn't appear to be these things that mattered. One way you might think about this, if you think about it in terms of a market model, that you're giving these schools autonomy and having them compete against each other, as parents could choose and parents could leave and vote with their feet and go to other schools that would pressure schools to improve. But we actually don't see much evidence that competition was the main factor. When we interviewed parents, when we interviewed school leaders and we asked them about competition, they described the kinds of things that they did to compete, and they were things like having friendlier front office staff and things like that really couldn't explain those improved academic outcomes. They weren't talking about academic programs and things that they did to compete. And when we talked to reformers and the leaders as a group, they never talked about competition as being one of the main factors. Innovation is another possibility. Maybe they discovered new ways of providing schooling that were just more effective. But when we looked at what the schools are actually doing, they're actually really conservative, and I would describe them really as throwbacks to an earlier era. They were very much focused on strict discipline, basic academics, much less on extracurricular activities. I would liken them to sort of the stereotype of what the Catholic schools were like, 30 or 40 years ago, with the strict nuns rapping students on the knuckles. So it wasn't really innovative. It was more retro, I would say. Autonomy, giving the schools autonomy, that might have had some role, although there's also a trade-off we saw in the data with autonomy, because when you shift all the administrative responsibilities down to the school level, it creates a lot of work at the school level that would normally be at the district level. And that was costly. So they had to hire a lot more administrators in total to handle the administrative responsibilities. And they also paid them more in the process. So that was kind of a double-edged sword, I would say. Choice, so maybe giving parents choice mattered, and I think it probably did matter some. The fact that the graduation rate is higher, for example, could just be that students were better matched to schools that met their needs. On the other hand, when we think about the measurable outcomes, families really weren't choosing based on the test scores or the graduation rates at the schools. They were choosing based on extracurricular activities and things like that. So that doesn't seem to be it either. There's another analysis we did showing that there was very high demand for a small number of schools, and most parents couldn't get into those schools. It was almost like college, where a lot of people apply and then most of them get rejected. It was the same kind of logic, and so parents didn't feel like they had a lot of choice for that reason, because they were ranking one school first, but they usually didn't get that first choice and ended up somewhere else. So at least there are limits on the degree to which choice was an explanation. All right, so if it wasn't that, then what was it? I would say that this new role for government was actually the more important thing. So the role of government changed. Some think that we were sort of getting government out and turning it over fully to a market model, but that really wasn't what happened. It was just a fundamental change in the way in which government was involved in the reforms. So one element of this is with the charter authorizers. So they're the ones who decide which schools get to function as charter schools and to open up. And they did, in New Orleans, took a lot of different steps in this. So one was to incubate new charter schools. They didn't rely much on the national market. They did have some KIPP schools, but for the most part, they were growing them locally. And they did that through a combination of the RSD, which is the Recovery School District, or a state agency that was acting as the authorizer, in partnership with another group called New Schools for New Orleans, which was a nonprofit, philanthropically funded organization that funded potential school leaders, gave them a substantial salary to spend a year developing a school and then helping them apply to open up a school. And then they had a process for selecting charters that was detached a bit from the political process. So there was a third-party group, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, that led the review process of the applications, and then the authorizer followed the recommendations of NACSA. And lastly, they were active in removing the low-performing charter schools and closing them down and giving the opportunity for someone else to run those schools. So I'm going to show one graph here. It's kind of it's a messy graph, but it highlights a couple of important points. So one is, and let me just explain what we've got here. This is a trend over time. The y-axis there is the school value added, or the student growth in the school. And there are three groups of schools here. One is the green line there is the schools that were continuously open the whole time. The blue line are the schools that entered the New Orleans market in those years. And the red line are the ones that were pushed out or taken over in the process. So a couple of key observations. One is that the entering schools, with the exception of 2010, were always better than the exiting schools. So in other words, they were taking over low performing schools, and they were finding schools through that incubation process and selection process that were higher performing than the ones that were leaving. And the other is that both of those lines are increasing over time, suggesting that they were also getting better applicants, and that even the ones that were being pushed out in the later years were better than the ones that were being pushed out before. So that the whole process of developing, recruiting, selecting charter schools got better over time and improved over time as the system developed. Now, you might also worry about, in that red group of schools that were being taken over, you might worry about what happened to the students in those schools. That it's disruptive to close a school, and the principle of do no harm certainly is a relevant one. But when we looked at that too, we looked at the students in those schools, and they actually did better also, which was a little bit surprising. And it turned out the reason they did better was that it was simply that they were moving from low-performing schools to higher-performing schools. So there was disruption for sure, but their academic outcomes, and not just their test scores, but high school graduation and college going, were better than they would have been if the schools had not been taken over. So it even seems like those students benefited, and then future cohorts benefited because those low-performing schools had been replaced. And the final set of ways in which the government mattered here is that there were a lot of problems in the initial years when it was more of a kind of free market approach. The way they treated special education students and excluding them from certain schools just generally selecting the students that they wanted, and then pushing out ones that they were less interested in serving. So the state stepped in and put more oversight into the system. They centralized the enrollment system, the transfer system, the expulsion system, the oversight of special education. So they started to put what some described as a fence around the market to create some boundaries and help avoid the worst tendencies of a system like that. So when I say that the government played a really important role in this and making it succeed, these are all the things that I mean. It was partly that takeover process of the low-performing schools, and also these other ways in which they managed the new marketplace, so to speak. So there are also a lot of concerns in this that I think are important to point out. It was a very top-down, outside-in process that has led to a lot of continued disenfranchisement and dissatisfaction with the kinds of schools that were opened, and those track along racial lines. So New Orleans is especially the public schools are overwhelmingly Black students, Black families. The teachers pre-Katrina were mostly Black, and they were fired. The Black caucus of the legislature voted against the reforms when the state law had to be changed to make this happen back around the time of Katrina. So there was a strong, especially at that early period, a strong racial element here, and it was essentially white leaders who were taking over and replacing Black leaders and Black teachers and taking over the system, I think that's a real concern, especially in today's environment where we more clearly recognize the structural racism and historical racism and the problems that has created and the ways in which we've treated African Americans. So that's a huge issue here. So when I talk about this in sort of shorthand, I often say, well, the measurable results were good, but the process was terrible. And that has consequences, a wide range of consequences, including for the long-term viability of this kind of reform. But it also had a more practical impact just on the kinds of schools that opened. So I mentioned that there were some schools were really popular and families were ending up in schools that were really not popular. And part of the reason there were so many really unpopular schools is that the community hadn't been involved in the process of deciding which schools to open. All right, so what does this mean for Providence? So I'm not an expert on Providence. You all are the experts on Providence, but I am going to take a couple steps in the direction of helping us think through what New Orleans might mean for Providence. So first, generically speaking, would we see the same results elsewhere? If everybody adopted the New Orleans model, would we expect to see the same results? Absolutely not. There are lots of reasons for that. One is that coming on the heels of Katrina, there's a lot of interest in coming to the city to help rebuild. And then once the reform effort started, educators who are interested in the reform effort really wanted to come to New Orleans because it was the hotbed of reform, like the Silicon Valley of school reform. The district schools were really bad. I mean, when I talked to union leaders, for example, when I first got down here, even they said it was terrible, and they thought it needed a major overhaul too. They wouldn't have chosen this particular overhaul, but there were very few defenders, and even when you hear people now talk about and criticize the existing system, nobody ever says we should go back to the old system. Also, the reforms brought in more money, so that's another reason why it was effective. And in most places, we can't really expect the reforms to be accompanied by more money. So I think you can think of New Orleans as the upper bound or the best case scenario for this sort of thing, but not necessarily not the only place where it could be beneficial. So what I started to do here is try to sketch out what's different about New Orleans, both in terms of the approach that they're taking and in terms of the context and how that might matter. So similarities and differences here. Again, I'm not the expert, and so some of this might not be totally right, and I'll be more than happy for people to critique this as we go into the question and answer. But I think it's a useful starting point for conversation. So on the top left there, the similar approach, I think it's a state takeover in both places. There's a goal of increasing school choice. There's a focus on data. Those seem to be three clear similarities. And moving down below that, the differences in approach. It seems like the direction is going to be less charter heavy and more focused on reforming the district operations and governance. There seems to be more active community engagement, as far as I can tell, in carrying out the reforms. I'm not aware of any increase in funding that's come along with it, so that's another difference. And then in terms of context, I mentioned the first mover advantage that New Orleans had. So that's different between the two cities. There's no larger crisis that affected and allowed for a whole scale change to happen. The size of the district, I think, matters for this sort of thing. I think it would have been hard to do it the way they did it if the district had been like Los Angeles or Miami-Dade, or New York, where the district is massive. So those are just a few of the factors that I think are important as we think about how different kinds of reforms might play out in different places. And I think there's a lot of open questions too about this that I'm sure will come up. What changes are going to be made in the union contract in Providence? Will they close and take over low-performing schools the way they did in New Orleans? They're talking of shifting control, decision-making down to the school level. Will they be able to do that? A lot of districts have struggled with that in the past. Will there be a moratorium or cap on charter schools? Can leaders build sustained community support in ways that New Orleans struggled with? So, the reforms will evolve, I think, is one thing to keep in mind. And we have our own set of questions in New Orleans. And so these are the ones that seem especially important in the Providence case. So I'll just end with this slide and helping us think through how you might answer those questions in terms of what actually makes sense. I think what we see in New Orleans, combined with lots of other evidence in other places that I summarize in the book, points to 5 roles for government. And I focus on the role of government here because the whole conversation is really about the meaning of public education, and by public we partly mean what's the role of government in this. So the first of these is accountability. There are lots of reasons to think a free market in schooling is not going to generate very strong accountability, and in any event, because it's public funding, accountability from the government is going to be important. Access to schools, ensuring that students have access. This is something we saw problems with in New Orleans, and there's other evidence that charter schools and private schools will tend to select students, and part of the idea here is to give more choice to families, not necessarily more choice to the schools and choosing the students. Transparency, making sure that there's good information for families to make decisions, and that the decision making about the schools is out in public and not secretive. Engaging the community in decisions, such as what schools are going to be open in a situation like that, having some way for the community to have input over the schools that open up. And choice with an asterisk. So I think choice, other things being equal, is a good thing to have, and families know the most about their kids, and should have that opportunity. It also comes with some cost, however, like transportation costs, for example, in New Orleans skyrocketed because now you've got students going all over the city, and that it's created an expense that actually takes resources away from other parts of the system. So I think these are the things that governments always need to do. I think we can think about public education more broadly than just traditional public school districts governed by local boards, that there are other ways to have public accountability, and to also push responsibility down to the school level. So there's not just one way to do that. So I will stop there and look forward to hearing from Susanna and Keith.
Thank you, Doug. That was really helpful and so to the point, and you got a lot of information out. So one thing I was wondering is that New Orleans, as you mentioned, clearly went through dramatic changes as a result of Katrina. So the whole economy was disrupted. Many families left the city. People were in shock, and resources flowed into the city that hadn't been there before, as you mentioned. Yeah. These disruptions alone could have caused change in schooling, just like the pandemic and federal investment, if it ever comes now, will change schooling because of the pandemic. What have you seen in New Orleans that makes you think that it's the charter school approach itself and this kind of change in government, rather than just kind of disrupting what seems to have been a kind of system in trouble? But if they'd replaced it with something, more like New York City, which is decentralized, or Miami, which is more centralized, kind of a district approach, why that would have not gotten necessarily the results that you see? Yeah,
it certainly is hard to rule out every possibility when so many things change, but we did try to rule out the main possibilities, or to test them in a sense. When I first came down here, I was actually really skeptical. I thought it must have just been population change because I've never seen results improve that much. So we worked with the Census Bureau to collect additional data on the demographics of the public school population of students attending public schools, and didn't see any real change there. We looked at changes in like the housing stock, and public housing was shut down, and they ended up replacing that with housing vouchers. And so looking at the timing of that, we looked at school buildings, so the buildings had to be renovated and so on. So we looked at the timing of that, in relation to when we saw the improvements, and we just never saw anything of the the top prospects, when we look at prior research about what affects student outcomes, we just never found anything that seemed to make any sense based on the timing of when the improvements or when the changes occurred versus the timing of the changes that we were seeing in the data on student outcomes. So we looked at it pretty hard, and I went into it honestly thinking that was probably most of it, and it just didn't show up that way.
Well, that's really helpful. So one other thing I was wondering about it, if you could talk a little bit more about what happened to teachers as a result of the reform, and in particular, what you think was gained or lost when the union power was cut in the reforms after Katrina, because it really was, as you mentioned, quite powerful before in a state that is right to work. Right. So there had to be something that the union was giving the teachers that they really liked before because they paid to be part of it.
Yeah. So the union was powerful. And so they fired all the teachers right after Katrina. And then by virtue of having them shift to state control and becoming charter schools, that automatically also, it's a little complicated. The union contract initially stayed, there was the district union contract, but then once they were no longer employed by the district, then they were no longer covered by the union contract. So that's kind of how the unionization itself got eliminated initially. But then the district actually decided not to renew its own contract either. So then even the handful of schools that were still within the traditional district also ended up not being unionized. And then a state law came in and got rid of tenure too. So then there were no job protections at all at that point. So I think, sort of the generic answer is, well, what do unions normally do that teachers like? Well, they give them job security, for one. They give them a voice in decision making, and clearly both of those things went away after the reforms. We see clear evidence that teachers were fired at higher rates, and that, in fact, when we surveyed teachers and asked them what was the number one change, the biggest change for teachers who had been there before and after, they said, you're much more likely to get fired than in the past. So clearly, those benefits of the union were lost. Then there's the question of, well, were the rules that were in place? And there was a long contract. It was I think a 200-page contract or something. I got a copy of it after a while. It took me a long time to track down a copy. But I got a copy and read the whole contract, and there were a lot of really specific things in there. So there were definitely not much flexibility built into that. So certainly trade-offs, and it's hard to say how much that contributed. It certainly was part of the motivation, though, behind the reformers doing it. I think there were the number one motivation, if you talk to them, well, I did talk to them, and they said it was they did not want the district to have control of the schools, full stop. Like, that was number one consideration. But you couldn't really separate that statement, I think, from the fact that the union was so tight intertwined with the district control. That was clearly the goal. It is hard. That part's hard to isolate in terms of it. It's not hard to isolate in that clearly it had an effect on how the reforms played out in terms of teacher turnover and job stability and how accountability worked. But it's hard to figure out how much of that actually contributed to the reform effects.
And do you have any sense now about how the current structure for teachers affects the kind of long-term ability of schools to attract a strong, diverse teacher workforce? Yeah,
it's hard. I mean, they're working on the diversity part in particular, because they fired, the teachers were 75% Black, and they fired all of them, and then for a while the percent Black was down in the 40s, so the substantial shift. They've gotten that back up to above 50%, but still not what a lot of the locals would prefer in terms of the maintaining a high quality. They've struggled with that, and one thing I didn't talk about is the recent sort of plateauing of the student outcomes. So after 2012, 2013, everything kind of leveled off, and now everybody's wondering, well, what happened? Why aren't we improving anymore? And I think one of the main answers is that they haven't been able to keep teachers, right? So basically you just have this churn going on, and if you're having to retrain 20-25% of the teachers every year because they're coming in fresh, then it's pretty hard to improve that way. You have to be able to maintain the skill level and take advantage of those early returns to experience. They've really struggled with that though. But the system, they keep saying that the system is almost designed to create turnover because they have no job security. They don't have a lot of autonomy either. So when we talk about autonomy, we tend to talk about it generically, but the schools had autonomy. The teachers got less autonomy, right? So there was almost a trade-off in who had autonomy in this. So they have less autonomy, less job security, lower pay, and longer hours. So when you put all those things together, it's sort of a recipe for turnover, and that creates a kind of ceiling on how much improvement that you can make.
That's really helpful. So I'd love, Keith, for you to come in now if you're ready for that, and let us know what this speaks to you, how this speaks to you about Rhode Island and what we can learn from the New Orleans experience.
So thank you, Susanna, and thank you, Doug, for your presentation. A number of things come to mind. As you mentioned, Susanna, I've worn a number of hats in public education here in Rhode Island, both in traditional districts involvement as well as charter school involvement. And so I take the approach to school reform as how do we deliver what is an essential delivery of an essential public service, that is how the education of our kids. And I think that is the ultimate goal. Now, New Orleans arrived at a point of opportunity through a natural disaster, Katrina. And there was an opportunity to really rethink, right, the model by which we serve that essential public function, right? And so they were able to reimagine and redesign a new way of doing things, a new way of doing that. So now Providence, we've also come to that crossroad, right? But through a different path. We didn't experience a natural disaster. However, if anyone were to read the Johns Hopkins report on the Providence Public Schools, while we didn't have a natural disaster, we certainly had what some could characterize as a public education disaster, all right? And so that report, that study, that found among a number of things, some of the things that they found that the culture of the Providence schools was broken, that that it lacked high quality instruction and aligned curriculum, what the essence of what schools are, that parents felt alienated and demoralized, so they weren't engaged. So it was a really damning report when you read it. And what it caused was for us to reach a point where we have to rethink this. We have to rethink how we are performing that essential public service. So now that caused the state, obviously, the state to come in and say, well, we're going to have to take over this reimagining of how we're going to perform this function. Now, unlike New Orleans, where the entire traditional district was wiped out, right? You start anew. We don't have that same opportunity here in Providence because we still have the existing districts. And so I don't think that the challenge is not to restart anew with a whole new different model. We have an existing model, but so the commissioner, as I understand her approach, is to while simultaneously trying to put in place a plan to turn around the Providence schools, right? And we'll go through the efforts that she had to develop a turnaround plan that engaged families, engaged stakeholders, got the community involved in the turnaround plan and the efforts to transform or reform the existing traditional district. She's also trying to expand what we mean by delivery of public education. I think that she's trying to take what I call a portfolio model. Now, that's my term. I don't know if she would use that term, but when I have conversations that I've had with her, she says, Keith, I'm for public schools. I'm for high quality public schools. And that can take many forms. That can take different forms. And I'm not partial to any form unless it's high quality and it serves kids well, and that families are engaged, and that teachers feel supported, and that the tools are there, right? That's her goal. And so we've reached this point of rethinking and reimagining how we deliver that core function. And so I think that we are still thinking this way. I think that Doug's findings of New Orleans can be instructive in that process, because he does ask some of the essential questions about funding and resource allocations, traditional underpinnings that keeps traditional districts in place versus the autonomy that charter schools are allowed to function with. There are a couple of things that I would point out. Some of the things that he said worked and what mattered, what didn't matter. I think that choice does matter. I think parents want to and are demanding the opportunity to decide what is the best educational environment for my kid. And if it's in a district school, fine. If it's in a charter school, I want that. But I want to determine what is in the best interest of my child. And I think that we're seeing that now with regards to a moratorium, charter school moratorium bill that's pending in the legislature, General Assembly, as a result of the expansion of charter school opportunities that the Council of Education and the Commissioner approved in December. And that expansion of 3 charter schools and 3 new charter schools caused folks involved with the districts to seek legislation to block those expansions, right? And as a result of that was born a parents advocacy organization. Parents are now voicing and mobilizing against that bill because they want the opportunities that these new charter school expansions would provide. So choice does matter. Parents are exercising their voice to say that they matter and that they have a right to decide what is in the best interest of their kid in the delivery of this essential public service. So that's the tension. I would agree with Doug that when you look at charter schools, the effectiveness of charter schools, the authorization process also matters, right? You want to make sure that that you're not just approving charter schools and willy-nilly, and that there's a really thoughtful and thorough process to vet these charter school projects, so that when they come into being, when they become operational, that they are held to account, that they are high quality, that they have all of the necessities of what is a really high-performing school. Culture and climate matters. Tools and resources matter. Engagement and stakeholder engagement all matter. These are sort of the essentials of good schooling, either district schools or charter schools, public schools. And I think that that's what the commissioner, who now has control of the Providence schools, those are what she's looking for. And so she's trying to create a portfolio of schools for which parents to choose from, but trying to elevate the quality of options for families to choose from. Now that causes some tension Now, I've been involved with charter schools going back to advocating when I was a community organizer for the enabling legislation to create charter schools. And that has always been the tension of a new model of delivery of this function versus the interests or the entrenched interests of the traditional structure, right? And that has always been the tension, and that tension continues to exist, and it manifests itself in a variety of ways, much like the moratorium legislation to block the expansion of charter schools in Providence. This manifests itself in a number of ways. But I think that what we have to maintain focus on is the delivery of service to students and families. That's essentially what matters. And it's not about the interests of who has a vested interest in either model. I think we have to have a focus on the effectiveness and the delivery of the service to students and families. And the other thing that I think we also have to focus on when we talk about resources, resource allocation, because obviously as public schools, both models, get public investment. And, those, who don't support charter schools, the argument is that you're taking public dollars away from the traditional model, and that's going to undermine our ability to sort of reform our district model. So the resource allocation is always that tension. I would ask the question, and I talk about this when I meet with business groups, and when I talk to legislators, we're talking about tax dollar investment, right? I think that as taxpayers who are investing in this essential service, we have to question, what is the return on that investment, right? And I ask this question, okay, those who don't want charter schools or say that money is taken away from the traditional districts, my question is, okay, what is the better investment? What is the investment? Which model is getting a higher rate of return for the public's investment? And I think that should be an essential question in determining what the portfolio of options should be. So we're not just talking about parent choice and parents deciding which school environment has a high expectations that I want for my kid, that has the resources that I want available to my kid, that has a governance structure that empowers the educators. So the parent satisfaction is important. And in our charter schools in Rhode Island, we have high rates of parent satisfaction in what we call survey works. That's the state system of understanding parent satisfaction, teacher satisfaction. Charter schools get a high rate of parent satisfaction because their kids are in schools that they know that have high expectations, that they know that the school can control its own resources and align their resources towards student need, right? And school-based autonomy is important to do that. You can make school-based decisions around resource allocations, hiring, those types of things, and you can make those decisions around actual student need, using data, knowing who your kids are, which kids need more interventions, what interventions, how do we align our resources to that, right? I think that the model itself allows greater flexibility to be responsive to students and families, right? That's why parents have been moving in droves towards our charter schools. Again, the other part of that is the public investment. So parent satisfaction and engagement, and the return on the public investment, right? I think that those are the two primary questions that we have to continually focus on, because it's not just about charter schools are better than district schools. There's always this adversarial dynamic. I don't think that it has to be. I think the most instructive thing that we have to focus on is outcomes. investment of public, return on the public's investment, and the outcomes for students and families. That's what has to be the essential questions that we ask and that Providence should be asking, and that the state should be asking, in trying to figure out how do we design this landscape of public schools offerings for students and families. And I think that the commissioner is going to do the process to try to figure that out. And so it's not, it's you know, the traditional tensions are still going to be there, right? And those of us who support charter schools, well, I can't even say that I'm just a charter school advocate. I am like the commissioner, I am a public education advocate, high quality public education. And I think, much like the commissioner thinks, that can take a variety of forms, right? You know, and obviously the devil's in the details about, you know, how schools are, the effectiveness of each school. But I think that those are the essential things that we need to always remain our focus on, and hopefully we can get the desired outcomes. So I know that sort of is more big picture, but that's the approach that I take. And I'll give you some examples, and I'll close. I've been a public school advocate, but I also was president of the Providence School Board. And I think, you know, when people talk about charter schools, one of the fundamental premises of charter schools was, as Doug says, it's the research and development of public education, developing innovative models, right, or innovative practices, right? And we're supposed to share different best practices to inform how traditional schools can function. That's all well and good. Sharing best practices, that's important. Professional development, that's important. I think that the most instructive thing is the model itself and the flexibility that charter schools have that traditional schools don't have. The ability to have built a school-based decision making, the school-based hiring decisions, school-based resource allocation. I think the model itself, not just the instructional practices or the curriculum that schools adapt. That's important, but I think the model itself is probably what is most instructive. And when I was on the Providence School Board, I tried to bring the model within the Providence school system. You know, we tried to do some in district charter schools so that teachers and convert some of the existing district schools to become charter schools, so that they have that autonomy and school-based decision-making at their disposal, as opposed to a top-down bureaucratic kind of structure. But you can have real school-based decision-making. When that failed, right, because there were entities within the PPSD that didn't want to embrace that opportunity, right? I introduced and we passed a school board policy on what we call school-based autonomy, right? Where we do bring decision making down to the administrative level at the building level, and there were some fundamentals of how principals working with school-based teams, school improvement teams that have parents and teachers on it, can operate and make school-based decisions, right? Billy didn't go that far because they didn't have the ability to maintain their own budgets. Teacher contract didn't allow them to do hiring and firing at the building level. So there are things that within a traditional district structure that underpin, right, or constrict or constrain the ability of district schools to have the same flexibilities to operate towards a student need. So
this is great. I'd love to kind of see how Doug, we could go into the dialogue part of this too. And Doug, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Keith said about the Rhode Island context, and really also I'm really interested in the potential for the kinds of government structure that you're talking about to apply to both the charter schools and, as Keith said, to the schools that are in control of the district, as well as a little bit on the chartering authority. You both brought up the importance of that, and I'd love to know more about how the chartering authority works in Rhode Island and how that compares to what it is, what we think of as good practice in that area. Doug, do you want to take a shot? I think you're muted, but.
Yeah, no, I think the authorizer is important. I think one of the things that is, I think, an open question to me and what happens in Providence is what happens in the long term. And actually, I don't know enough about how the authorization works at the moment. Although with the state takeover, it's sort of a amorphous situation. But eventually, the state takeover probably ends. And then maybe you end up with a situation where the district is functioning both as the manager of some schools, the traditional public schools, but also the governing body in some sense of the charter schools. Cities have struggled with trying to do both of those things at the same time. Partly because of the built-in tension between charter schools and traditional public schools that Keith alluded to. That's just kind of historical and I think persists. But there's also a difference in the perception of the responsibility. So now that in New Orleans, the control is back in the district's hands of all these charter schools. So now the district has an elected board and it chooses a superintendent just like a traditional district. But that superintendent doesn't have any managing responsibility over the schools, right? So it's a totally different thing. One of the reasons I think they've been able to manage it so far is that it's shifted completely in that direction. So I'm not sure how it looks when a district is trying to, for some schools, it's going to do that. And for other schools, it's going to still be the manager. I think that's tough to do. Districts have generally not, in democratic institutions generally are not good at treating different people or different organizations in different ways. They tend to treat them the same way. And so I'm not sure how that looks in the long run, trying to maintain both systems. I'm not saying that means you should go 100% charter or not, but the track record for this kind of an approach with the district having all the control is not great. The track record is also not that great for districts generally in decentralizing decision-making to traditional public schools, right? The idea of school-based decision-making, that's been around a long time. That's many decades, people have been talking about that, but it's the political pressures at hand with school districts make it pretty hard when they have the ability to exert control over schools to not do it.
So if I may, should I jump to Susanna?
Yes, jump right in.
Yeah, so in Rhode Island, unlike some other states, that have districts can authorize charters, colleges and universities can authorize charters, they can be authorized. In Rhode Island, only the Department of Education, the Council of Education can authorize charters. And so that creates an interesting dynamic for the commissioner who now that the state controls the Providence Public Schools, they have the responsibility to transform the traditional districts while also having the authority to approve new charters, right? And so I think that's what's causing a lot of the tension, because people are trying to figure out where does chartering fit into her transformation plans for Providence, right? And is she going full board charter, or is she really going to focus on really trying to reform the traditional district? So that's where a lot of the tension is coming from. My own sense is that she's trying to, take this portfolio approach. She's going to try to do both simultaneously. There's a turnaround plan for the Providence schools, but she also wants to expand the field, expand the landscape by also authorizing new charter schools that can serve her.
So it raises an interesting question about the idea of portfolio is generally that you have a single portfolio manager, right? And if only the state can authorize charter schools, and if you're going to end up with a decent share of charter schools in the end, and if the district is eventually going to go back to local control, it kind of begs the question of probably not, it's not going to really be portfolio at that point, because the district isn't going to have any governing authority over the charter schools.
No, that makes sense. So, you know, I think about this, and it's very complicated, of course, because there's New Orleans where it all went charters. It's places like this where we're trying to do two things at once, which is definitely a possibility if the chartering authority does it well and the people who are in the district is doing a good job with the schools. You really could have both. And there are places in the country not very far from us that have both kinds of school systems or both kinds of systems working. But just because of what New Orleans did, I'd like to think a little bit about how we set up the charter part of this to work well, because we can see in places that have tried the New Orleans approach and it hasn't really worked very well. So something like Tennessee, when it had its achievement school district, it said, here, you could imagine taking the schools in Providence, for example, and making them all charter schools. But we've seen examples of that haven't worked very well. That you give them to charter school organizers and they don't improve. It doesn't turn out to be good. So it doesn't seem as much that it is certainly one kind versus the other, but there's something about how they do it. So if you were doing this, Doug, and you said, well, I'm going to take a system and learn from New Orleans and make sure that it had this, what are the elements? Like, what should the chartering organization be thinking about? What should the oversight look like? What should the measures be? I don't know. What are the elements that you think are really key on this?
Yeah, I think, well, how you measure performance is really key, especially if you're going to be hard-nosed on accountability, right? So that's the thing that I think most distinguishes New Orleans from other places, is that they were very strict on the accountability side, and so that they were opening up charter schools after Katrina and then shutting them right back down again because they weren't up to standards, and then finding somebody else and find another charter school to take over that school. So I think that's probably the most, and that was that one graph with the red and the blue lines that I know is a complicated graph, but it was such an important point that that was such a key driver behind the improvement in New Orleans. But that also means then that the measures you have in the accountability system become really critical. I mean, it really, the school leaders have absorbed the idea that they must get a higher letter grade, and meaning higher test scores and graduation rates, that they sort of live and breathe that. So yeah, I think those measures are too narrow. They're also not focused enough on growth, as opposed to just looking at the levels of outcomes. So I think that's clearly. So another way to put this, and I think this is why I'm so focused on it, is if New Orleans had just opened up the schools that they had right after Katrina and the charter schools they initially brought in and just stopped, there would have been almost no improvement in the long run. So I think that tells you that how important that was. And so I think fine, and this is sort of consistent with other research when we look at like the Credo results, looking at what's the trajectory of charter schools, and they don't get much better after the first year. We found the same thing in New Orleans, that the 1 year improvement, and then they're going to basically plateau at that point. So you got to, if they start off low, they're gonna stay low, and we haven't seen evidence of places that have been able to kind of have gradual improvement over time across a large number of schools.
Keith, how are we at that in Rhode Island? So do we close charter schools if they're not effective? And then if we don't, I mean, I could see a disruption. I mean, Doug, you didn't see that as a problem for the student, but I could see that as a problem in a place like Rhode Island. I'd love your thoughts on that. Keith, sorry.
Me or Doug?
Yeah, you, Keith.
Oh, okay. So just last year, we closed our first charter school, Academy for Career Exploration for performance. And I think that it gets back to what we talked about, the authorization process one, and then the accountability process that holds schools accountable to continue to because when the effort and the due diligence is done at the very beginning in authorizing, I think you're laying a foundation for a school to really be solid and to be able to evolve and improve. So you have to, in the authorization process, make sure that schools, and that you're not, some states have taken a different approach where they take a quantity. Okay, we're going to approve multiple charter schools and we'll see which ones sink or swim. We'll just close the ones that can't. In Rhode Island, we took a very different approach. We were very methodical and selective and due diligent as to which schools got authorized. And when we took that approach, those strong foundations that have strong school leaders, that have strong boards, have strong policies, have strong curriculum, those laid a really good foundation. And so over time, they've become really, really high quality schools because they had a really strong foundation. And that's why over 25 years of charter, I think our first charter school was authorized in 1998, right? All of those schools are still in existence, and they are holding to form under the state's accountability system, right? In which they are evaluated. And so in Rhode Island, there are two accountability systems for charter schools. There's the accountability system with report cards and data and all that affects all public schools, right? But then we also have that added accountability system of the charter renewal process, or the charter reauthorization process, where every 5 years you have to show your test scores, you have to show your financial stability, you have to show your level of parent engagement, you have to show your level of board policy involvement, you have to demonstrate your worth and quality every 5 years. And so our schools take that very, very seriously. So the authorization matters in laying the foundation, but the cycle of accountability also matters because it keeps charter leaders and their boards and their faculties and staff, on task because they know they're going to be held to account. And like I said, up until last year, we've only had one charter school that has been closed due to low performance. And I think that is a testament to how we've approved, managed, authorized, and held schools accountable over the last 20 years.
That's really helpful. One of the things you both brought up was family engagement in the process. And of course, choice allows families to choose. But as Doug said, one of the problems that you saw in New Orleans is that the schools came in, didn't really meet families' desires, didn't really, because families weren't engaged in more the systemic parts of the choice system. So I'm interested, particularly after the pandemic, where it's so important to think about the whole child and students' well-being, full well-being, given all the stresses that have been on students and parents, that what do you think are good approaches, both in the traditional system and in the more choice-based system, for fully engaging families, both in their own choice, but also, so things like information, but also in making sure that the system is responsive to the kinds of schools that they want?
So one of the things they started doing in New Orleans, this is around 2015 or so, there was a new leader of the Recovery School District who was local, born and raised in New Orleans, and he saw this as a problem, the lack of engagement. So he recognized it, and so what he started to do when they knew that they were going to have a school that was going to be taken over, he would get a committee of community members together, and they would bring in the charter schools that had been authorized by the state, that were sort of in on the bench, you might say, that they hadn't been open, but they had been approved to open without a location. And then they would basically interview them and say, okay, here are a few schools that are approved that are interested in locating in your neighborhood. Which one do you like? which one would you prefer? And it was not, they didn't have legal authority over the decision, but the district, the recovery school district, followed, at least in several cases, followed the recommendation of the community. So I think that's a way in which that kind of thing can happen. I can imagine a more formal version of that. With traditional public schools, it's, in some sense, it's harder, because with charter schools, they have their distinctive models, right? So there are things that are truly different about them, you know, that their curriculum focus and the culture of the school and approach to discipline and things that are really fundamental. But traditional public schools, you know, they're not whole units in a sense, right? It's hard to imagine what community engagement looks like for what type of school. Well, it's a traditional public school, it's going to be tend to be more cafeteria-like. We're going to do all the things that traditional public schools do, and not trying to be as distinctive as the charter schools are. So I'm not sure, you know, other than through the usual school board process, I'm not sure whether the same logic even applies, because the whole approach is different when you're talking about a traditional public school versus a charter school.
And Keith, do we have good systems for engaging families in the kinds of chartering decisions and things like that in Rhode Island?
Well, I can tell you that many, if not all of our schools, I mean, it varies, you know, family engagement, community engagement, you know, it varies from school to school. I mean, they gotta figure, but there are really good models in which it is done. And family engagement is just not, okay, we're going to have the bake sale for the basketball team. And, you know, family engagement really is creating a welcoming environment for a family, right? Many of our schools have family centers, a room in the school for families actually to come in and engage in the school. Right, family engagement for some of our schools means being a community school, where you're not just educating the kids, but you're also trying to provide. And this is particularly in our schools, like in Central Falls and Providence, where, you know, we're talking about low-income families, right, that don't have and so the school is where they go really to try to get resources, and so. Having wraparound services and such, right? That's another form of community engagement, family engagement, because you're really not just enrolling the child, you're enrolling the family, right? And some schools do that very, very well. I look at a school like Segway Institute in Central Falls, he does that very, very well. And the reason that he does it so well is because the Segway School was born out of the Ralph J. Holden Community Center. And so it was a community center that had an after-school program for the middle school kids that weren't doing well in the middle school. So the leader of that school said, "Well, I'm gonna create a charter school that will provide an option for families at the middle school level, and we're going to build out a school program, but we're also going to maintain sort of those types of services for families that we usually do." And so he's a full community school. So family engagement is creating a welcoming environment where families feel that they're welcome to come in and meet with teachers. And you know, when you speak to a lot of families that I had, particularly families like that don't speak English, it's not their primary language, they feel intimidated when they go to try to engage with their kids' school. And so that is a reality that schools have to recognize when they are creating their school cultures and environments, right? You have to recognize that. You have to be intentional in creating a welcoming environment for families to want to engage, right? So I think that, and some schools do that better than others, but I think charter schools allow the flexibility to be able to create those environments.
Yeah,
So
that's-
can
sorry.
I just add one more thing on it? So one of the things that's kind of interesting and was a little surprising to me at first about engagement in the charter schools is I think the first thought is, okay, well, if the charter schools need to maintain enrollment and there's this pressure to maintain enrollment because that's what drives revenue, that you would expect them to be really responsive to parents in that situation. And one of the things that was striking to me is it almost seems like it's the opposite here, in that when a parent goes and talks to a principal and says, I really don't like this element of the school and I think you should change it, the response is usually, well, maybe the school isn't a good fit for you and you should go to some other school, which is, it's almost the opposite of approach. It's sort of like the Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty. Like with the threat of exit, like the school leaders also use the exit possibility to in a sense brush off the concerns. Whereas in a traditional public school, the engagement isn't over the choice of the school and who's running the school, it's over a school improvement process, right? So instead of you're exercising your voice in the school as opposed to exercising your exit. So I think so that's the way in which the whole conversation about engagement is, I think, fundamentally different in the two kinds of schools.
And that's one of the things that we really focus on. And one of the things that when I work with our charter schools, counsel them against is there's two things, there's creaming kids in where you only select the best kids and you have a selective process, to get the best kids. And then there's cropping kids out. So the creaming and the cropping. The cropping is when you get the kid in the school that, that really is mischievous and, really hard to manage. And so you kind of counsel them out. Either of those practices are in my view, against the principle of what charter schools should be about. Charter schools should be about enrolling all kids and making all kids and families feel welcome, and to be able to be so student-centered that you're able to be responsive to the needs of each individual student and family. And so that you're not trying to counsel kids out because he acts up in class, right? Or the parent is difficult to deal with. You have to be able to work with and be responsive to those students.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to, just because we're getting towards the end, I want to open it up to some questions. So please, people who are participants in here, please write down questions if you have them. There are a couple that are there already. There's one that speaks to me because it asks, what is the process that was used to allow communities to choose between different potential schools? And I think that's interesting, both like how do you choose between the schools, but also how do you choose between these kind of school approaches? What are, and I'm not actually quite sure from the question whether they mean kind of the selection process, Doug, that you were talking about, or for us as a community in Rhode Island, how we think about these two kinds of schools and how we make these decisions in a good way about what schools should be available for students. So I would love to hear, even our conversation, the panel itself gets some pushback because there's such strong feelings about charters and how threatening charters are. But really, we want to be able to learn from experience and decide what's good for the students in Rhode Island. So how do we have these kinds of conversations, and how do we choose productively between all these choices that we have for systems here?
It does seem clear that different parents want different things, right? So there are a lot of parents who want the KIPP model, the more of the no excuses and strict, more academically focused programs, and then there are a lot that don't. So I think that seems to suggest that we should want a variety of schools, that take different approaches, and maybe that's why you might want a mix of charter schools and traditional public schools, because traditional public schools tend to do things in a particular way that a lot of people like too. So the other thing interesting about New Orleans is that the one school you cannot choose in New Orleans is a traditional public school. right? They're right. That option is not on the table. And I think a lot of families would like that, right? So I think in that sense, if it would be probably a good thing if we had some that were still managed by the district. So that's just an initial.
I think I would agree. I think that for parents to choose, what school is best for them, they have to know what they're looking for. They have to know and what type of environment their child is going to thrive and succeed in. And Doug used a good point. That's why we have to have a variety of options for families to be able to discern from. Now, that can be very, very challenging because, families, if you have a variety of options, you want to make sure that you're doing your research and trying to determine which is the best environment. Some families, they just want an option other than the traditional district. And so they'll go to, we have what we call in Rhode Island, Enroll RI. And Enroll RI is a site where all of our charter schools are listed. And so a parent can go get information on each of those schools, and depending upon, the communities that they live in, can apply to multiple schools from one site, right? But the parents themselves have to access the information to know what school they're actually applying for and what that school has to offer, and that can be challenging for a lot of families. A lot of families don't, have, the time and, ability to be too discerning. And so they'll go to a school and they'll say, well, this school serves Providence and it serves the 8th grade. And so these schools serve those grades. I'm going to apply to all of these schools. I'm going to play them, and I'm going to apply to all of those schools. And whichever one my kid gets in, then that's the school I'm going to go with. Because some parents are just applying as an alternative to, what they traditionally had, right? So parents make the decisions for that way. So parents make decisions as to what school to enroll for a variety of different reasons, and it's all about whatever the parents' desire is or what their level of desperation is in some cases.
Do you think there's a tipping point? So at some point that having charter schools is really supportive of the whole system, because no matter what a traditional school system does, there are going to be kids whom it doesn't meet, whose needs it doesn't quite meet, and so having charter schools is really useful in that case. But do you think it gets to a point where, as one of our audience asked, the percent of charter schools that puts public schools into a death spiral, that you can't kind of balance both charter schools and traditional public schools?
So we're actually looking at this question in a different study. We're looking at a national level, trying to figure that out, looking across cities that have had different numbers of charter schools come in, trying to see that. And what we're seeing so far, this is preliminary, but it seems like the biggest benefit is somewhere between like 5 and 15% of enrollment, and then it plateaus at that point. So it doesn't seem to help, although there doesn't seem to be a tipping point where it sort of shoots down, where the case that's usually brought up is Detroit as a place where there was a sudden shift, and the district just wasn't able to handle the steep decline, which was happening in the context of also continued declining enrollment. So you had declining enrollment in total, and then you had even faster declining enrollment because charter schools were coming in, and the district struggled. I don't know if that was the cause of it or not, but that's sort of the story that gets told. So it's an interesting question, and so maybe there is some generally optimal range if you're going to go the charter school route, but we're still trying to figure out if the data support anything like that. I don't think
the goal with charter schooling is to replace traditional districts, and so sure, at some point you want to try to strike what is that correct balance of charter school opportunities while also maintaining a traditional district structure, because we just don't have we'll never have a total supply of charter school seats to accommodate the number of school-age children in charter schools. So you still have to maintain this traditional district structure and try to improve it to be effective and serving families. But I don't know,
Yeah, well,
where that balance is, but there has to be one.
There's a follow-up question that's really interesting too, which is Tracy Miller asks, can you help me understand why we're still experimenting with education delivery models? And so are we still, why are we still experimenting with education delivery models? And I'm just going to add on a little, how much of that is because we really haven't learned anything and we don't know what's happening in schools, or how much of it is because the world has changed, our needs have changed, our options have changed, and we're adjusting to that in our education system right now? So how much is just our lack of understanding and we're experimenting, and how much is that we're in this kind of dynamic time?
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, if you ask me, charter schools are not an experiment anymore. We're not exploring whether or not they can work or not. I think that it's been proven that if done correctly, right, if they're authorized in a due diligent way and they're held to account, that charter schools as a model can perform that essential public service in a high quality way, right? So I think that experiment from 25 years ago, this concept of charter schools, has proven that the model can work. So to that extent, we're no longer exploring that as an experiment. Now, but I also think that it's just the I think it's always a good thing to continue to try to innovate, right? I don't think that innovation is a bad thing, right? And so we should always be trying to explore better ways to serve a certain function, because that's how, I think that, I don't think that that's a bad thing,
So I have a two-part answer, I think, depending on what you mean by delivery model. So I think the experiment is the idea of a charter school in the sense that it's a school that is kind of conceptualized and created by an individual, managed by that individual, and subject to some sort of a contract with the state. So that's that versus the model of a traditional public school. That was the experiment, and now we're 25 years into that. But I don't think we're really experimenting all that much with the kinds of charter schools that are opening. Basically, what they're doing in New Orleans is a perfect case of this, is stuff that used to be done 70 years ago, right? This is just, it's very basic, direct instruction, focus on 3 R's and not a lot of extracurriculars, and have strict discipline. That's not an experiment, right? That's just, that's something we already knew you could do that, and now it's just schools. So it's more differentiation than I would say innovation. That schools are kind of putting their recipe together, taking the ingredients that have always been there and putting them together in somewhat different ways. But it's not so much as about innovation as it is about matching up with what families want with what schools do, and doing it well, right? So it's not even just about the type, but how well do they actually execute that particular model.
That sounds great. So unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to give you each 30 seconds to tell us your final, what you really want us to take away from this discussion. So Keith, I'll have you go first, since it's Doug's book that we've been focused on.
Okay, for me, public education is about serving students and families, right? That's what it's about. And we should always be focused on outcomes for kids. And, the model shouldn't have to matter, right? So long as the model is effective in delivering that essential public service. and it's not a competition. I look at public education as a service delivery. And if Uber can get me from Lower Manhattan to, Harlem, I don't need a gypsy cab, right? It's just a different way of doing it. But if there's a way of doing it, and there's a way of delivering that service in an effective way where families feel that they're being served well and the community at large is being served well, then that's what we should be focusing on and not get caught up in the tensions of this model versus that model. They both can coexist if done well and done effectively.
Thank you. And Doug, take us home.
Well, first of all, just thanks for organizing this, and it's been great questions and great back and forth. And I love having trying to see how this works and what it might be useful for in other cities. So greatly appreciated. I think in addition to what Keith said, I think we should always be looking to do things better, and there are different ways to do that. I think we shouldn't define public education so narrowly as just in terms of the basic structures of the school board elections and school district management and so on. That there are other ways to do things that are public education and that serve the needs of children, that serve the needs of communities, all of which are important, and that we should always be looking for different ways and studying them carefully. It's hard. I think one thing I try to get across in the book is that it's hard to judge success, even though New Orleans was really positive on all the measurable things. That there are also lots of the unmeasurable things, some of which we didn't even get a chance to get to, that are challenging to assess. And that there are a lot of old truths about schools, that there are lots of different kinds of good schools, and a lot of this just comes down to who's going to make the decision and who has the most control over the process. And we'll continue to struggle with that, but hopefully we're all struggling with it in a way that pushes us in the direction of looking to make public education work better for everybody.
Thank you so much. And Doug's book is available. I encourage you all to read it. It's really insightful, not only about New Orleans, but how we think broadly about the kinds of things Doug's talking about, what the role of government is, what the role of families are, what the role of the community is in deciding what our schools should look like and making sure they're running in the way we want them to be. So thank you all for being here today, and I hope you come back to our events in the future. Have a really good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.